Hello everybody and welcome to the current issue of Inside Insurance. My name is Jean Ray and I'm your host for the series. Today we're going to delve into the topic of SEAR, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues Derek Hegarty and John O'Donnell. Derek is a partner in our KPMG law practice and head of financial services regulation. He advises insurance and other regulated firms as well as senior management on compliance with regulations. In particular, he represents clients in their engagements with the central bank, including as part of PCF assessments and investigations and enforcements under the administrative sanctions procedure. John then leads our insurance regulatory practice, and he joined the firm from the central bank back in 2012. John has over 20 years' experience in the insurance sector, covering prudential supervision, conduct of business, financial control and compliance matters. So thanks both for joining me today. I suppose maybe just for the benefit of the audience, we might start with a question really just to get some high-level background to SEAR and to the regulations.
Yeah, thanks, Jean. So individual accountability, as the name says, it's about bringing the clarity around roles and responsibilities of individuals in banks and insurance companies, and bringing conduct standards and rules around how people behave in the office, really. So it's an important development because in insurance we've had the Corporate Governance Code since 2011, and our other rulebook, which is really Solvency II, was very quiet in this area because we have, in Europe, we have a different regime where we have supervisory boards and management boards, whereas in Ireland, UK, we have only the single board structure. So Solvency II didn't really get into governance very much. The insurance companies have been implementing this over the last number of months. It's interesting because the high impact firms that we know well, the domestics that are in the market here, would have probably been well prepared for this. They would have substantial presence here, both in terms of executive team and departments. Our international firms, the cross-border subsidiaries of large groups, are different. They operate with a significant sort of outsourcing model often, a lot of delegation, often lean organisation structures here, so probably more challenging for them to implement the requirements, which are around statements of responsibilities, responsibility maps, and then preparing themselves for showing how, if things go wrong, they've taken reasonable steps.
Do you want to add anything, Derek, on that one?
Just really, for me, Jean, at a most basic level, SEAR is about driving improvements in performance, appraisal and accountability. And it looks to do that by prescribing responsibilities and duties and making firms allocate those to specific individuals. Yeah. So for me, that's where I go back to when I think about what's this about. It's about really identifying those duties and responsibilities and allocating them to specific individuals. Yeah.
And John, you mentioned there that I suppose insurance companies have been working on this over the last few months. I suppose, what have been some of the key activities and how have we been helping them as well?
Well, different ways, Jean. So advice, just an sort of interpretation of what's expected, because firms, within any firm you have individual roles, but you also have committees in operation, subcommittees of boards, executive committees, subcommittees of the executive committee. So how all that knits together, firms had various queries and we advised on that. Then in actually implementation of the documents that are required, we've helped draft statements of responsibilities and responsibility maps and so on. And, there's room for interpretation there as well. Some firms have taken quite a detailed approach. We're both PCFs in this space. We've received statements of responsibilities. Not all are the same, and how that gets leveled off as things go forward will be interesting, because the central bank hasn't seen any of these. Very few anyway. They'll begin to see some of this documentation when people apply for new PCF positions, because there the statement of responsibilities has to be submitted. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from a supervision of this, whether the central bank is happy with all the range of levels of detail we've seen in it. And So most of our support has been in that documentation space. I think further down the line, hopefully there won't be many prescribed contraventions to deal with, but where there are, how people took reasonable steps, I don't think firms have really got, fully around to think about, the MI that's needed to show that. So further work ahead as well.
Yeah. You touched on some of the potential challenges there around the documentation and embedding that, but I suppose, Derek, what other challenges did you see in terms of firms trying to implement this? Was there any timeline or requirements understanding or any of those kind of challenges?
I mean, every firm had to grapple with the allocation of responsibilities essentially across the PCF population, and that had its own challenges, individual challenges, professional challenges. So every firm would have grappled with that, and the output of that would have been, responsibility statements and a responsibility map. For me, the piece that presents the most challenge, and John mentioned it there, is the documenting of reasonable steps. So again, if we think about the essence of SEAR, it's that prescribing of responsibilities and duties and allocating them to individuals. So that's imposing on individuals an obligation to comply. But what it also does is it grounds all of it, and the entire individual accountability framework rests on the basis of reasonable steps. So where reasonable steps are taken, that's a full defence to any suggestion of a prescribed contravention. Okay, so there you have, what is required and what's required to meet it in a very simple form. The challenge is documenting that. So you've got to generate evidence of compliance, and you've got to do that in the most seamless way. So the way that impacts least on how the PCF goes about carrying out their day-to-day activities. If half their day is spent documenting compliance, that's not going to work. So I think what we're going to see over the next while, and maybe this is a challenge for every firm, is the refining of that generation of evidence, that documenting of reasonable steps.
Okay. John, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, well, just going back a step again, when SEAR-IF was being introduced, there were concerns among individuals, non-execs, INEDs, about the risk involved in trying to defend, what they would, assume they were going to do, which was behave well, and maybe where there was a problem within a firm. I think that's been alleviated a bit by central bank commentary that they're not out to get people or anything like that. And when we look across the water as well, there haven't been that many cases in the UK on this. But as Derek says, when there is an issue, you need to be able to produce the evidence that you took, the right steps. And there's MI that you can look to in terms of your area. If you've got personal responsibility for a certain area, the systems and controls are working well in that area, that the people in that department have the knowledge and experience, that where there have been recommendations by internal audit, for example, that they were dealt with quickly and that you've kind of acted. So there's always a history, but you need to be able to do more than talk to it. You need to be able to point to things and say, this is what we did, and so on. So
yeah. And what do you think the main benefits coming from this will be, or whether there'll be any changes off the back of it into the future?
I think the main benefits are going to come in the form of increased clarity and certainty, particularly for PCFs. So we now have detailed guidance from the CBI on this. We also have statements of responsibility, and there's a certain black and white clarity that comes with listing all of an individual's responsibilities on a page. So I think that's going to be of assistance. And challenges, I think, are going to be closely linked. The definition of reasonable steps is very broad. It's any steps. It's reasonable in the circumstance for the person to take. I think people, are not unreasonably going to focus on that to a large degree. And I think if there are investigations and enforcement actions, I think that definition will come under scrutiny.
Yeah.
Maybe just add as well, Jean, we've had fitness and probity for many years, but it has looked back at whether the individual was fit and proper at the day they accept or take on an appointment. Conduct standards are about in the moment, how you behave in the job. You could pass fitness and probity and then conduct yourself very poorly, which we don't want. So that is an improvement, that it's a live sort of test rather than just a look back to some, way one behaved in a previous career. So that's a positive. Just going back to the point about outsourcing and delegation, that's a challenge for some of the firms who have that, heavily outsourced model, because the old line we've always said, you can delegate or outsource the activity but not the responsibility. So you still own that as a PCF. So and where, for example, you're outsourcing to a sister company, you might actually be dealing with a person who is more senior than you in the hierarchy of a group, and holding them to account now under SEAR is it's delicate. It always has been, but this brings it into more focus.
Yeah. And just on that then, what would you see in terms of expectations for the future, or any other developments in the area, or are we done now? It's just a case of implementing it.
Well, I think it's here to stay. I mean, it's the direction of travel in comparable jurisdictions. So I think it's a feature of life for those working at senior level in the industry. I think that's for sure. I think we're going to see interesting developments around reasonable steps frameworks, about the refinement of those. I think there's real advantages that can be gained for firms. If they can get this right, they're going to make life easier and more attractive for a PCF. If they can use technology, they're going to have efficiencies in how their PCFs carry out their work. So I think there's a lot to play for there, and it's very interesting. Specifically, I think one area that I think we may see some movement in and some challenge is around minute taking. So at governance fora, you're going to have a collection of PCFs trying to make decisions, and that's going to bring in a sort of a group dynamic issue. And bearing in mind, this is an individual accountability framework, and individuals will not unreasonably want to make sure that all of the steps they take are clearly documented. That can bring minute taking into a difficult position, and could make minutes something they aren't today. So I think some further guidance and maybe some industry insight into that would be welcome.
Yeah, and to pick up on that point, it was a feature of, I suppose, the reaction to Corporate Governance Code many years ago, where board minutes, now I know you're talking probably more about executive and subcommittee minutes, but board minutes became very much, there was a sense that everybody in the room needed to be named in the minutes, and, asking good questions, which encouraged some good behaviour, but also encouraged some sort of slightly odd situations where unnecessary discussions and so on. So, and we've all probably in our career been in meetings where we leave the room wondering what decision was made and who actually made it. So hopefully that'll also become a thing of the past, if you like, with the requirement that everybody knows what's happening and minutes will record in the right way. Just in terms of the future, the way over the last few years, the way these new initiatives get supervised generally is that, to be fair to the central bank, it takes some time, allows the firms to implement, embed, as they say, and then takes a sort of a thematic view of practice, and ultimately it results in a Dear CEO letter rather than going out and picking on just one firm. And now the advantage of that is you get the benefit of a wide sort of sample of what has been done. It does tend to lend itself to raising the bar very high for everyone, and proportionality is therefore needed in terms of how that plays out. But it isn't a bad way for it to sort of develop over the next year or so. So I think that will probably happen.
Yeah. Well, thanks a million. Very hugely insightful. I suppose just to wrap up, if there was one thing you'd like the audience to take away from today, what would that be? So starting with you, Derek.
Well, I'll stick with the area I'm most familiar with, which is enforcement, so the far end of the spectrum, and just the importance of evidence at that point. So, you know, most people will never end up there, but it's still really important to have evidence of the steps you take, because they become crucial if they're needed.
Yeah, prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah.
John?
Yeah, kind of in the same space. I don't think, and hopefully, as I say, there'll be very few, I don't think you need to prescribe contravention to test the what-if scenario for your own personal role and responsibilities. So you can actually, people should be asking themselves, what if something went wrong in my area? What's my file to go to show that I did the right thing? And on that particular, there's probably, you know, a couple of difficult points around handover of work, you know, in insurance, between actuarial and finance, or vice versa, between claims and reserving, and who owns what to what point and who takes it on. So there's things still to be thought through in those sort of grey areas within departments and between departments. Yeah,
the devil's in the detail, I think. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope you found the session useful. As usual, if any of the content today resonated with you, please feel free to reach out to myself or Derek or John, or your usual KPMG contact. So thanks for joining us, and hopefully we see you again soon.